Holy Spirit, breathe on me. Let your presence fill this place. We lift our hearts to you. Some people look very holy in church. They sing loudly. They pray with great feeling. They carry their Bibles everywhere. And everyone thinks they are the perfect example. But sometimes the people who look the most godly are fighting battles that nobody knows about. 3 girls in this church were admired by everyone, until one day something happened, and suddenly the whole church started asking questions. Stay with me until the end of this story, because before it is over, you might learn something important about judging others and about the people we think we know well. This is a circle of African tales where African wisdom lives, and every story has a lesson. Sunday mornings in New Haven City were always full of life. Cars lined the dusty sides of the road. Sellers sold meat pies and bottled drinks outside the church gate. The air was filled with the sound of drums, keyboards, and happy singing coming through the open doors of Faith Restoration Assembly. Inside the church, the place felt alive. People clapped their hands. Voices rose in worship. Feet tapped on the tiled floor. Standing at the front of the choir stage was Lisa. She held the microphone gently, her eyes closed, her face tilted slightly toward the ceiling lights. Her voice was clear and strong, filling the church with warmth. Behind her stood Kim and Ruth, dressed in matching white choir gowns, their Bibles resting on the music stand. The 3 girls had become well known in the church. People admired them. Some even envied them. They were always early for service, always respectful, always involved in church activities. To many members, they looked like the perfect example of what young Christian women should be. Lisa slowly raised her free hand as she led the next line of the song. Her voice became soft, then rose again, guiding the people in the church. People in the seats closed their eyes and sang along. An elderly woman whispered to the woman beside her, "Look at that girl. Lisa sings like heaven is listening." The other woman nodded in agreement. "And those girls she moves with, Kim and Ruth, such well-behaved children." Near the back of the church, a group of young ladies watched the choir with admiration. "They are serious with God," one of them said quietly. "Very serious," another replied. "You hardly see girls like that anymore." At the front row sat Pastor David, his hands folded, watching the choir. His face was calm but thoughtful. He had known those 3 girls longer than most people in the church, long enough to understand that life sometimes hides things beneath beautiful appearances. But that morning he said nothing. The worship song ended. The people in the church clapped loudly. Lisa lowered the microphone, smiling politely, while Kim and Ruth exchanged quick glances beside her. For a moment, they looked like ordinary young women enjoying a good church service. After the sermon and closing prayer, the church slowly emptied. People gathered in small groups outside the building, talking under the shade of mango trees. Children ran across the sandy yard. Lisa stepped out through the church doors first, holding her Bible against her chest. Kim followed behind her, fixing the sleeve of her white dress. Ruth came last, quiet as always, her eyes looking down at the ground as she walked. Outside, members greeted them warmly. "God bless you girls," a woman said. "You led worship beautifully today." Lisa smiled humbly. "Thank you, Ma." A middle-aged man shook his head with admiration. "This generation still has good girls. Look at them." The 3 girls walked together toward the gate, laughing softly. Kim nudged Lisa playfully. "You almost turned the church into a concert today." Lisa laughed. "It's called worship, madam." Ruth smiled faintly but said nothing. To anyone watching, they looked like ordinary church friends enjoying a peaceful Sunday afternoon. Eventually they reached the roadside. The church crowd thinned as people got into cars or walked toward nearby streets. Kim stretched her arms. "I'm starving." "You are always starving," Lisa replied. They shared another laugh. But as they walked further down the street, away from the church, something about the way they felt slowly began to change. The laughter got softer. Their steps became quieter, almost like they were thinking deeply. Because Sunday afternoons eventually turn into evening, and evening brings a different world. Night arrived slowly over New Haven City. Street lights flickered on one by one. Music began drifting from nearby bars and clubs. Cars moved through the roads with bright headlights cutting through the dark. In a small apartment on the second floor of an old building, Lisa stood in front of a mirror. The white church dress was gone. Her makeup bag lay open on the small wooden table. Kim sat on the bed behind her, putting on lipstick. Ruth stood near the window, quietly tying her hair back. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of traffic outside. Kim broke the silence. "Tonight might be busy." Lisa did not answer right away. She simply stared at her reflection. Then she picked up an eyeliner pencil. "We don't have a choice," she said softly. Ruth turned from the window. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think anyone from church would ever come to this part of town?" Kim gave a small, dry laugh. "Church people here." She shook her head. "They're too busy praying about sinners." Lisa finally turned away from the mirror. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. "We just do what we have to do." No one argued because each of them understood the truth behind those words. A few minutes later, the three girls stepped out of the building and walked into the glowing city streets. Cars passed, music echoed from nearby clubs, and neon lights painted the road in colors. They were not dancing. They were not drunk. They were not behaving wildly. But they were surviving. And surviving does not always look holy. They walked carefully along the sidewalk, speaking quietly to each other as the night grew deeper. Then suddenly across the street someone stopped walking. A church member, a middle-aged woman who attended Faith Restoration Assembly every Sunday, had just stepped out of a taxi. Her eyes froze as she stared at the three girls under the street light. Lisa, Kim, Ruth, the same girls who had been singing in church that morning. The woman's face slowly tightened with shock. Her voice dropped to a stiff whisper. "Those girls." She looked again to be sure. Then she shook her head in disbelief. "Are these church girls or street girls?" The rumor did not start loudly. It began the way most dangerous rumors begin, quietly like smoke before fire. By Monday morning, the woman who had seen the girls on the street had already told 2 people. By the afternoon, those 2 people had told 4 more. By evening, the story had grown. Legs. Inside Faith Restoration Assembly, whispers began floating through the hallways like invisible wind. First it sounded like confusion, then curiosity, then judgment. Someone said they saw those choir girls outside last night. Outside where? In that nightlife area near Silver Junction. Impossible. But curiosity is powerful. And gossip spreads faster than truth. By Tuesday evening, the Youth Fellowship WhatsApp group was buzzing with messages. One person typed, "Please, is it true that Lisa, Kim, and Ruth were seen around Silver Junction?" Another replied almost immediately, "I heard the same thing." Third message followed. Maybe it was just people who looked like them. But someone else wrote, "The person who saw them goes to our church. She said she is very sure." The conversation exploded. Question marks, voice notes, opinions. Within hours, the entire youth fellowship had heard the story. And by Wednesday, the whispers had reached the older members of the church. Women gathered after the midweek service, shaking their heads. "I always said something about that Kim girl looked suspicious," one woman muttered. Another woman sighed dramatically. "These days, young people pretend to be too holy." A third woman leaned in closer. "They sing in the choir during the day and roam the streets at night." She made a loud sound with her tongue. "What a shame." Nearby, 2 men stood near the church gates discussing the matter. "I saw them leading worship just last Sunday," one man said. The other folded his arms. "That is why you must not trust appearances." Inside the church office, even the ushers had started whispering. Hypocrisy. Deception. Double life. These words began sticking to the girls' names like thorns. But none of those whispers knew the full story, because truth rarely travels as fast as judgment. That same evening, inside a small hospital ward across town, Lisa sat beside a narrow hospital bed. The light hummed quietly above her. On the bed lay her father. His breathing was slow and unsteady. Tubes ran across the blanket, connecting him to a machine that blinked softly in the dim room. Lisa held his hand carefully. Her eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from a worry that never seemed to rest. A doctor stood at the foot of the bed, looking over a clipboard. "The treatment is working slowly," he said calmly. "But the medicine is expensive." Lisa nodded quietly. She already knew that. The hospital bill had been growing like a storm cloud. Every day added more weight. Every injection, every test, every extra night. Her father stirred slightly and looked toward her. "Lisa," he said weakly. "I'm here, Papa," she replied softly. "You should not be worrying about me like this," he murmured. She forced a small smile. "Just focus on getting better." But inside her chest, the pressure was building because she knew the truth. Without money, getting better becomes very hard. Outside the hospital room, Lisa stepped into the hallway and pulled out her phone. 2 missed calls from Kim. 1 message from Ruth. She typed quickly, "How is your mother today?" Ruth replied almost immediately, "Still looking for work. Nothing yet." Lisa leaned against the wall. Ruth's family had lost everything months earlier. Their small shop had burned down in a market fire. Insurance had not covered the damage. Since then, survival had become a daily battle. Ruth tried to stay strong, but sometimes even faith feels heavy. Another message arrived, this time from Kim. "Call me when you're free." Lisa stepped outside the hospital building and dialed her number. Kim answered right away. "You still at the hospital?" Kim asked. "Yes," Kim sighed. "I spoke to the landlord again today. He is giving Ruth's family 2 more weeks before they are thrown out." Lisa closed her eyes briefly. Life seemed to pile problems on top of problems. "And that man?" Lisa asked carefully. Kim's voice became slightly harder. "He hasn't stopped looking for her." That man had been bothering Ruth for months. A wealthy older man who believed money could buy anything, including people. Kim had stepped in before things got worse. Since then, she had kept watch like a guard dog protecting a friend. Because sometimes being bold is not about being proud. Sometimes it is about protecting someone. Lisa breathed out slowly. So tonight, Kim understood the question without needing an explanation. "We go again," she said quietly. Lisa nodded, even though Kim could not see her. "We go again." Later that night, the city streets came alive again. Cars moved through the roads. Music floated from far-off clubs. Under the glow of streetlights, Lisa, Kim, and Ruth walked carefully along the pavement. They were not laughing tonight. They were focused and alert, like people who understood that the world can be both kind and dangerous at the same time. Ruth kept her arms folded across her chest. "Sometimes I wonder if God is watching all this," she mumbled softly. Lisa looked at her gently. "God sees everything," Kim added quietly. "And He knows why we are here." They kept walking, not knowing that someone nearby had already noticed them. A young man stood near a parked car across the road. He had attended Faith Restoration Assembly once or twice with a friend. He recognized their faces right away. His eyes widened slightly. He slowly lifted his phone. The camera opened. Without stepping closer, he zoomed in. The screen captured 3 familiar faces under the streetlight. Choir girls, Bible carriers, Sunday worship leaders, walking through the nightlife streets. He recorded quietly. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Then he stopped. He stared at the video on his phone for a moment and smiled slightly, because in the age of social media, secrets rarely stay hidden. By morning, that video would begin spreading inside the church, inside the youth fellowship group, inside private conversations. And the rumor that had started as smoke was about to become fire. By the time Sunday came again, the atmosphere inside Faith Restoration Assembly was different. The same church that used to greet Lisa, Kim, and Ruth with warm smiles now looked at them with suspicious eyes. Whispers followed them like shadows. Some people stopped talking when they walked past. Others stared openly, shaking their heads. The video had spread faster than anyone expected. Someone had posted it inside the youth fellowship group. Another person forwarded it to the general church WhatsApp platform. Before the girls even woke up that morning, the entire church had seen the short clip. 3 familiar faces under a street light. The same girls who sang in the choir, walking slowly through the nightlife area. The caption someone added underneath made things worse. Are these the same church girls? By the time Lisa stepped into the church compound that Sunday morning, she could already feel the change in the air. Conversations stopped when she passed. Followed her quietly. Kim noticed it right away. She leaned closer to Lisa as they walked toward the building. Something is wrong, she whispered. Lisa said nothing, but she had already guessed what had happened. Ruth walked behind them, holding her Bible tightly. Her hands were shaking slightly. Inside the church hall, the choir members sat in their usual seats, but the atmosphere felt cold. 2 girls who normally greeted them warmly avoided eye contact. One young man muttered something under his breath as they passed. Kim turned quickly. What did you say? The man looked at her boldly. I said some people like pretending too much. Lisa placed her hand gently on Kim's arm. Leave it, she said softly. But the tension in the room kept growing. Before the service even began, one of the church ushers came over to them quietly. Pastor David would like to see you after service. Lisa nodded calmly. All right. But her stomach had already tightened. The service that morning felt longer than usual. Lisa did not lead worship. Someone else had been given the job. No explanation. No announcement. Just a quiet change. While the congregation sang, Lisa sat quietly between Kim and Ruth. She could feel eyes on them. Some curious, some judgmental, some disappointed. By the time the final prayer ended, the whispers had grown louder again. The usher returned. Pastor is waiting. Inside the church office, several leaders had already gathered. The room felt heavy. Pastor David sat behind his desk. 2 elders stood beside him. Another woman from the church leadership sat quietly with a tablet in her hand. Lisa, Kim, and Ruth stood near the door. For a moment no one spoke. Then one of the elders cleared his throat. Lisa, he said slowly, we have seen something that worries us. The woman with the tablet tapped the screen. Then she turned it toward them. The video began playing. Street lights, night road, 3 girls walking. Lisa, Kim, Ruth. Silence filled the room. The elder shook his head slowly. You girls are choir members. You lead worship. You pray in this church. He leaned forward slightly. So explain to us why members of this church are seeing you walking around nightlife areas. Kim folded her arms. Her eyes flashed with anger. You think you already know the answer. The elder's voice became harder. This is not the time for pride. Another leader spoke sharply. People are already calling the church. Do you know the shame this brings? The woman with the tablet sighed. Young girls these days, pretending to be holy in church while living a different life outside. Ruth lowered her head. Her eyes were filling with tears. Lisa felt the pressure in the room growing. The same church that once praised them now looked at them like criminals. Finally, Pastor David spoke. His voice was calmer than the others. Lisa, she looked up. Tell us the truth. The room went silent. For a moment Lisa said nothing. Then suddenly her voice cracked. My father is dying. The words hung in the air. Everyone in the room went still. Lisa wiped her eyes quickly. He has been in the hospital for months. The bills are more than we can pay. She looked around the room slowly. I tried everything. Small jobs, cleaning houses, working during the day. But hospital bills don't wait. No one interrupted. Kim stepped forward slightly. And Ruth's family lost everything in that market fire months ago. She pointed gently toward Ruth. They are about to be thrown out of their house. Ruth wiped tears from her face quietly. Then Lisa continued. We didn't go to the streets for fun. We went because surviving sometimes forces you into places you never imagined. Her voice trembled again. But every Sunday we still came to church. We still prayed. We still believed that God had not forgotten us. The room remained silent. Even the elders were no longer speaking. But Lisa was not finished. She looked directly at them. You all say the church is a family. But when my father first got sick, her voice broke slightly. I asked the church for help. Pastor David's eyes widened slightly. But Lisa continued. The welfare committee told me the church budget was tight, so I stopped asking. A heavy silence settled over the room, because suddenly the situation looked very different. This was not a story of rebellious girls. This was a story of people who were desperate. Even Pastor David's face had changed, because he knew something the others did not. He had seen the request Lisa had submitted months ago. He had meant to follow up, but other matters had taken his attention. Now the result of that silence stood before him. 3 young women who had been trying to survive on their own. The elder who had spoken the loudest earlier leaned back slowly. His voice was no longer as confident. You are saying, Lisa nodded quietly. We never stopped believing in God. We just ran out of options. The room remained silent. But outside the office something else was happening. Members of the church were already gathering in small groups, phones in their hands, watching the video again, shaking their heads, judging. And inside the church walls that had once celebrated them, Lisa, Kim, and Ruth stood waiting, not for forgiveness but for understanding. And for the first time, even Pastor David was beginning to realize something painful. The real problem in this story was not the girls. For several seconds after Lisa finished speaking, the room stayed completely silent. The elders who had spoken so boldly earlier no longer looked sure of themselves. The woman with the tablet slowly lowered it. Even the air in the room felt heavier, because the story they had believed so easily was beginning to change. Pastor David leaned back slightly in his chair. His hands folded together as he looked at the 3 girls standing before him. For the first time since the meeting started, his voice was softer. How long, he asked quietly, has this been going on? Lisa wiped the tears from her face and answered honestly. 6 months. A small gasp escaped from one of the church leaders. 6 months, the elder repeated. Kim nodded. Yes. Her voice carried less anger now, but there was still strength in it. We didn't wake up one day and decide to live like this. She gestured slightly toward Ruth. Life pushed us there. Ruth had been quiet for most of the meeting, but now she slowly raised her head. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke. After our shop burned down, my family had nothing left, she said. My mother has been trying to sell vegetables by the roadside. She paused, swallowing hard. But some days we don't even make enough money for food. She looked down at her hands. I prayed every night that something would change. No one interrupted her. Sometimes, Ruth continued softly, faith doesn't take away the storm, just helps you stand inside it. The room went quiet again. One of the elders shifted uncomfortably. He had been the loudest voice earlier. Now he avoided looking directly at the girls. Kim spoke again. And about that man who was bothering Ruth. The church leaders looked confused. What man? One of them asked. Kim's face became serious. A rich man who thinks money gives him the right to control people. He has been putting pressure on Ruth for months. Ruth lowered her head again. Kim continued. I stepped in before things got worse. So if people see us in certain places at night, she shrugged slightly. Sometimes we are protecting ourselves. Sometimes we are protecting each other. The silence that followed was deeper this time, because the story no longer looked like hypocrisy. It looked like survival. Lisa looked around the room slowly. We never stopped believing in God, she said. Even on the streets. Even on the hardest nights. Her voice broke again. Do you know what it feels like to sing worship on a Sunday morning, after spending Saturday night praying that your father doesn't die because you can't afford his medicine? No one answered. 'Cause some questions do not need answers. They only need honesty. Pastor David slowly stood up from his chair. His face showed something rare for a church leader. Regret. I remember when you first brought your father's situation to the church office, he said quietly. Lisa looked at him. You remember? Yes, he replied. I remember. He looked down briefly. And I also remember telling the welfare committee to review the request. He paused. But I did not follow up. His voice grew heavier. I assumed someone else would handle it. Another uncomfortable silence filled the room, because sometimes neglect is not loud. Sometimes it happens quietly, through delay, through getting distracted, through assuming someone else will take care of it. Pastor David turned slowly toward the door of his office. Outside, faint voices could already be heard. Members of the church gathering, whispering, waiting to hear the outcome of the meeting. He turned back to the girls. You three have carried a heavy burden alone, he said slowly. Lisa said nothing because sometimes an apology comes too late. Pastor David took a deep breath. Call the church leaders together, he told one of the elders. We are going to address the congregation. The elder was surprised. Today. A few minutes later, the church hall filled again. Members sat quietly, sensing that something important was about to happen. Pastor David stood at the pulpit. The three girls stood behind him. Some people in the crowd whispered again. Others folded their arms, waiting to hear what would happen. Pastor David raised his hand for silence. Then he spoke. Today we all watched a video. A low murmur spread through the room. Yes, he continued. We saw something that caused many people to judge quickly. He turned slightly toward Lisa and Kim. But today we are going to hear the full story. For the next few minutes, the truth was shared. The sickness, the hospital bills, the fire that destroyed Ruth's family's business, the nights of fear, the choices made out of desperation. The room slowly changed. Faces that had once looked angry now looked uncertain. Some people lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped their eyes. Because the truth does something powerful. It takes away the comfort of easy judgment. Pastor David finished speaking and stepped aside. The church remained silent. Finally, an elderly woman stood slowly from her seat. Her voice trembled. Child, why didn't you come to us again? Lisa answered gently. Because the first time I did, no one came. That sentence landed deeper than any sermon. And suddenly the room understood something painful. These girls had not been living double lives. They had been carrying double burdens. Faith on Sunday. Survival during the week. 2 battles. 1 heart. Pastor David returned to the pulpit one last time. His voice was calm but firm. Today we learned something important. He looked across the congregation. Holiness is not proven by how loudly someone prays. It is revealed by how we treat people who are struggling. He paused before continuing. And before anyone leaves this church today thinking they are better than someone else, remember this. The loudest church voice does not always have the most righteous heart. The room fell quiet, because that truth had touched everyone, even those who had whispered the loudest earlier. And as people slowly began to leave the church that afternoon, one question lingered in every mind. A question that would stay long after the gossip disappeared. Who is truly righteous? The one who looks holy, or the one who keeps struggling and still refuses to stop believing? And that was how the story of Lisa, Kim, and Ruth spread through the church. 3 girls who had once been praised as examples of faith. 3 girls who had once been admired for their dedication. But behind the white dresses, the Bibles, and the worship songs, there had been struggles that nobody saw. Sickness, poverty, fear, responsibilities that came too early in life. And like many people who carry heavy burdens quietly, they had tried to survive without making noise. For months they had prayed. For months they had hoped things would change. But when help did not come, life pushed them into choices they never imagined they would make. Yet even in those difficult moments, they still showed up every Sunday. They still worshipped. They still believed. They still tried to hold on to their faith. And that is what made the story so uncomfortable for many people in the church. Because sometimes the people we judge the fastest are the ones fighting the hardest battles. Sometimes the people who look strong are the ones barely holding their lives together. And sometimes the people who speak the loudest about righteousness are the ones who have forgotten what kindness looks like. That day, something changed inside Faith Restoration Assembly. Not because 3 girls were exposed, but because the church was forced to look at itself. To remember that faith is not proven by how things appear. It is proven by how we treat people when their lives get messy. Because real life is rarely perfect. People struggle. People fall. People make hard decisions when surviving feels heavier than reputation. But the real test of a community, especially a church, is how it responds when someone is struggling. Do we judge first, or do we try to understand? Do we gossip, or do we help? Do we push people away, or do we pull them closer? Lisa, Kim, and Ruth were never pretending to be perfect. They were simply trying to survive without losing their faith. And in the end, their story forced everyone in the church to face one uncomfortable truth. Holiness is not measured by how loudly someone prays. Holiness is measured by how much kindness someone shows. Because sometimes the people standing quietly at the back of the room, the people everyone thinks are strong, are the ones silently asking for help. And sometimes all they need is one person willing to listen before judging. So now let me ask you something honestly. If you found out that girls like Lisa, Kim, and Ruth were in your own church, would your first reaction be to judge them? Or would you try to understand their story first? Every story carries a lesson. And if this one touched you in any way, let it guide your heart and inspire your journey. I hope you enjoyed this African folktale. If you did, please subscribe for more amazing life-changing stories. Don't forget to like, share, and drop a comment. And if you want more, the next story is already waiting for you on your screen. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you. See you in the next video.